my name is Sarah Heidenreich. I'm a researcher at the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Cultures and supporting the coordination of Team Society. And very briefly, for those of you who didn't join before, Team Society is a group of researchers within the social sciences and humanities at NTNU who study energy and sustainability related issues. And we basically do two things. We have a couple of research projects, and we also try to showcase and present the diversity of research happening at NTNU within the social sciences and humanities. Yes, today we have a webinar with the topic Engaging with End Users in Zero Emission Neighborhoods, Examples from ZEN's Living Labs. The presenter is Ruth Woods, who is a researcher at the same department as I work in, the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Culture. And we also have a discussant, which is Per Gunnar, who is a professor at the University of Oslo, who is leading a work package at the FME Include. Yes, I think I will give the floor to you, Ruth.
Thank you, Zara. Thank you for inviting me to present and giving this opportunity to present some ideas that are very much a work in progress. So this is the start of something that I'm writing after doing 3 living labs over 4 years within the context of ZEN. Something a little bit more about myself. I am an anthropologist and I am work at the same department as Zara. But I am, a lot of my work, 50% of my work is associated with the ZEN Centre, the Centre for Zero Emission Neighbourhoods in Smart Cities. And within this context, we were working with living labs. A couple of clarifications before I begin. There are actually no zero emission neighbourhoods currently in Norway. It's a concept that's under development by ZEN, and I will say a little bit more about the concept in a couple of minutes. The term end user is an awful term. But it is often in use in building research to describe people who end up in buildings, the people that live and work there. And by using it here, I'm highlighting an attitude or an approach to citizens, the public, the people and the households, the young and the old, who come in at the end of things and often have very little influence on the design and development of buildings that they engage in their everyday lives. And this is the kind of approach to neighbourhoods and pilots that we are trying to avoid to the framework provided by Living Labs. So firstly, a little bit about ZEN, and then I will tell about our understanding of what a living lab is and how we use it. And then I will give you some examples of pilot neighbourhoods. 3 of these, but 2 of them I will talk very, very briefly about. The final one, Idali, I'll say a little bit more about and present some examples from that work. To begin with, ZEN's ambition. Sustainable neighbourhoods with 0 greenhouse gas emissions, that is the aim. And to reach this ambition, ZEN works with, amongst other things, facade solutions, energy systems, LCA, and renewable energy sources in 9 pilot neighbourhoods around all over Norway, from Bodø in the north to Oslo in the south and Bergen in the west. ZEN is very technical. There's not very much that says something about building users, citizens, or everyday lives in the ambitions and the solutions that ZEN is working on. But it is talking about neighbourhoods. And this is where Living Labs come in, making the connections with the local context and the citizens. In many ways, ZEN is a socio-technical imaginary. Jasnov describes socio-technical imaginaries as collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures, animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technologies. Imaginaries of sustainability can be both descriptive and prescriptive. ZEN's imaginary aims for a zero-emission future. Technological systems are to achieve this in interaction with neighbourhood contexts. The imaginary is supported by 32 stakeholders, partners from industry, municipalities, public companies, and researchers. Imaginaries of sustainability present a set of goals and values for science and technology, but where technopolitics and techno-scientific optimists may prevent alternative imaginaries. Using Living Labs, we have gathered knowledge about how ZEN's imaginary is received and interpreted. This goes beyond the context of differences that influence the way the pilot works, i.e. climate differences, the size of the pilot in square meters and population, or how long the planning process is expected to take. In the Living Labs, we gain insight into how this relates to or challenges people's everyday lives. ZEN's imaginary is not just a goal. The imaginary includes a series of key performance indicators, KPIs, that are intended to offer some flexibility. Of the 7, some are more relevant than others depending on the neighbourhood. The pilot neighbourhoods are not expected to achieve zero emissions in all these 7 areas. Now, the screen shows all the 7, though maybe one of them is hidden behind the picture box. Instead, the relevant ones, those deemed achievable, are chosen, usually 3, and zero emissions is aimed for within these 3. ZEN's partners, stakeholders, and researchers choose key performance indicators for each pilot. And the main question that we'll be asking today is, how are technology choices and solutions received by the people living their lives in pilot neighbourhoods? So ZEN is working with pilots. This is a means of working that the construction industry is comfortable with because it provides real-life examples. And ZEN has chosen Living Labs to navigate between citizens and ZEN solutions. Living Labs is a known format that has been used to deal with a variety of challenges, from testing technology to dealing with processes of urban transition. ZEN's pilots are dealing with both, sometimes at the same time. Using the framework of a Living Lab is part of a broader shift in the nature of urban governance and part of a wider politics of experimentation. Sengers from 2016 suggests that Living Labs are a form of transition experiment where the aim is to stimulate complex processes of social technical evolution, but where the focus is on who participates, what is learned, and who appropriates what is learned. We've used the framework of Living Labs to gather information, ask questions, discuss ZEN and its solutions, and to design and implement experiments. The work with Living Labs considers how ZEN is received by the neighbourhood, more concretely the citizens, not the stakeholders who are ZEN's partners, who have a stake in seeing ZEN being a success, but homeowners, building managers, workers of all ages and backgrounds. The intention is to be open and participatory, allowing an approach to piloting which takes seriously the contribution of occupants, their history and creative capacities. This takes the forms of anthropological navigation, where pilots become lived spaces, where outsider perspectives embodied by new technologies and architectural solutions are combined with the citizens' experiential knowledge. The idea of lived space comes from Rodman and from 1992. According to Rodman, an outsider views a place as a location or setting for concepts, while a local understanding of place is socially constructed through everyday practices representing spatialized experience. Rodman suggests that a more useful understanding of place combines local and outsider understandings, establishing a lived space. This lived space, combining local and ZEN knowledge, seems relevant in pilot neighbourhoods. So, to the pilots. Working with Living Labs has been interesting and challenging, but not everything has been successful or relevant to the social context. But there has been some incremental learning. I have learned some things, a few things, and I hope to improve as I continue my life as a researcher and working with people over 4 years. And I'm presenting some brief snapshots. One thing we have learned from Living Labs is that one size does not fit all. So things that work in one location won't necessarily work in the next location. Everything is context dependent. And each lab has highlighted a different set of challenges for the introduction of ZENs and for the use of Living Lab methods. So it's not just the ZENs problem, it's also the ZEN methodology, which is a challenge. So I have 3 examples here. The first one is Zero Emission Kindergarten in Lø in Steinkjer. It's a small neighbourhood on the outskirts of Steinkjer, a couple of kilometres on the outside. This pilot was, we began quite early in ZEN in 2017, just after ZEN started its research period. And this pilot was cancelled in 2018. And it was a case of local democracy winning over ZEN's universal concepts. It never actually managed to get established as a realistic concept within the neighbourhood. And this surprised all of us, including myself. The researchers, the municipalities thought this was, as it says in the quote here, a fantastic opportunity. This is a wonderful building. the old NRK offices in Steinkjer that was going to be rehabilitated and turned into a kindergarten where two existing kindergartens were going to be co-located. But the kindergartens didn't like this idea. And though they had expressed it in different ways, we from ZEN and from the municipality didn't hear what they were saying. They said things like "riv skiten," and I can translate this to being "pull that shit down," but it doesn't have quite the power that it has in Norwegian, so I kept it in Norwegian. They said this, but we still didn't think that they really meant it. They took the situation into their own hands because it's Steinkjer, a small community, and they could gain easy contact with local politicians. They sent a letter to the local politicians and they changed their minds. They said, we don't want the ZEN pilots, we don't want to rehabilitate the building, we will pull the building down, build a new kindergarten. And interestingly, very interestingly, the main arguments that were used against the ZEN concept were the technologies that were to be included. So solar panels on the roof, the kindergarten manager said they would be expensive both to build, to install and to manage. They didn't want to share the space with other building users. The 24-hour building concept that is often mentioned as being sensible because you use the space over 24 hours instead of just using it for 8 or 4 hours. This was not acceptable. They also didn't like the idea of reducing the number of private cars for work or for delivering children. These were accepted ideas within a sustainable concept, a universal sustainable concept. They weren't accepted in Steinkjer. And I mentioned about the KPIs in the beginning. I don't know what the KPIs were in Steinkjer because at that stage they weren't established as part of ZEN. They weren't clearly defined what we were going to work on. But the rejection of the technology indicates that probably the KPIs that was chosen wouldn't work. And this is learned from the other ZEN pilots. So the next one, Campus Everstad, is much more established. They've been working with zero emission technology for since 2009. They were a ZEB pilot and now they're a ZEN pilot. And they have all sorts of technology. It's a technical playground for researchers and for Starts Big. So they have a lot of square meters of solar photovoltaics and solar panels. They have a biomass burner, which is producing electricity. They have a zero emission building. They have a district heating system. They're working on a vehicle-to-grid system for battery charging. So they have an awful lot of technology. And the focus of the partners is optimization of building management. They want to improve how the systems work together. That's their focus. And when they suggested when we were talking about experimenting, they wanted to work on something which optimized even more. And they chose an old building, which is on this building, very small, very tiny, and it's not part of the zero emission system. It's outside the system, and what it did, we did save money and electricity. We saved 2,000 kilowatts in the summer in the space of a month, but it also showed that this building wasn't part of the system. It wasn't part of the zero emission context, because it wasn't part of the technology system. It doesn't receive any of the solar power. It doesn't have any of the zero emission technology in it. The building users are also not part of the system. They know nothing about ZEN and ZEB. It's not part of their everyday lives. So they're sort of outside what is happening. So the last one, which is EDLI, I will talk a bit more in even more detail. And forgot about the KPIs for Evenstad, which is energy and power and innovation. Those are the ones that have been chosen for the pilot by the stakeholders. So in Elverum, it's greenhouse gas emissions, energy and mobility, which have been chosen for the pilot by the stakeholders and researchers. And I will be focusing mostly on mobility in the rest of the presentation. And this is what we have done in the ZEN Living Lab in Elverum. This is an overview of which was presented to the partners of all the activities that have taken place in 2020 and 21. There is more. It's only a very brief overview. It was influenced by Corona. You can't do anything with that. So things ended up being digital instead of meeting people face to face, which changed the whole quality of how I was working. And in this context, I was able to apply some of the things I've learned and experienced from the other living labs. Importance of getting to know citizens when you're starting a living lab and not relying on what stakeholders or partners are telling you. Don't assume all knowledge is already available. ethically giving something back to the context. This is something I experienced very strongly in Everstad. I could never help the people in the building that was left out of the ZEN context. I couldn't do anything for them. And so something or other should be given back. But what is that? In some cases, it's a film, as in Italy. It can also be chocolate, something as simple as that, but it should be something more. And also that results, good and bad stories are equally of value there, and they can be used in different ways. So all solutions, sustainable for developing sustainable solutions. But what I've done in Elverum is talk to the whole community, not just the pilot. I've not focused on the pilot. I've spoken of Elverum. Italy isn't there, the neighbourhood. It's not been built yet. There's a school there and a kindergarten, but the building of the homes isn't in place. And so I work with the children, I work with youth, I work with adults, and I've tried to understand what makes Elverum tick. What is interesting in Elverum today? How do they think about their lives, their everyday lives? What do they expect for the future? So quite a big thing to swallow in a short space of time, really. So the focus in Elverum has been the good life. And if we assume that ZEN will impact on people's everyday lives, what would be lost or what would be gained for being included in ZEN's imaginary in Elverum? Would being part of ZEN living in a sustainable neighbourhood reduce their quality of life, their access to the good life, or will things get better? To understand that, we need to know more about how people live today. What is the good life? How is well-being defined in Elverum now? Now, the terms good life and well-being are often used interchangeably. Good life is rather a qualitative term, whereas well-being is measured quantitatively, internationally and nationally. But they both point to subjective experiences, happiness and satisfaction. The conversations with Elverumsinger, and they call themselves that, so I often use that to talk about them, took the form of a journey through Elverum today and into the future, starting with questions about the local population, what do they like, what do they work on, to questions about local history and architecture. Then I asked about how they understood sustainability and their expectations for the town of Elverum, the plans for Idyllic neighbourhood. Finally, I asked them to give me examples of stories about good life. The reason for this conversational narrative about Elverum is that when gathering an understanding of the implication of ZEN, its aims and the key performance indicators in Elverum, you have to understand Elverum and its people. It's not a blank slate. It is a town with 15,000 inhabitants spread out through a town centre, quite a lot of people. There are shops, there are services, and out into the district, into villages that are spread out over a wide area. And for many people, it is this which is on the screen. It's heaven in a forest, with all it offers the citizens. And this has implications for ZEN and its sustainable concept. And when I started in Elverum, I was working with the children and gathering their words about Elverum, the pictures that they took, and they emphasized all the time the importance of the forest. It seems to surround them, protect Elverum. It's always close by. And a picture developed in my head about this Elverum in the forest, and I should have known this. I have traveled through past Elverum many, many times. If you travel to Oslo from Trondheim or from Oslo to Trondheim, you will drive past Elverum, obviously not into Elverum, and you see the forest, you meet a lot of forest. And never really thinking about this and not thinking about it before I started my fieldwork. But it's a very, it defines in many ways Elverum. And Elverum is a town, and it does have all the services, schools, workplaces, training facilities, hospitals, doctors, dentists that you expect in a town, although none of these are given in a small town like Elverum. They're losing their hospital. There's a problem with that at the moment. But at the same time as this town, they can walk out of their door and into the forest. They can ski, they can walk, they can bike, they can do all these things. And as with the children, the conversations, the adults returned again and again to the forest. It was almost unbelievable. In fact, at one point, I didn't believe them, that they were so preoccupied with the forest, because everybody told me that outside my house, it only takes me 5 minutes to get into the forest and go skiing. I can put my skis on outside my house and I can go straight into the forest. And I thought, is this possible? But they said it again and again. And the opportunity to walk out of the door and go skiing, it provides a quality that is invaluable. Although not everyone loves the forest, teenagers see that it has value, but they don't love skiing. And foreigners who are settled in Elverum struggle also with the skiing. But most of them describe it as a positive thing. It provides a framework for everyday life, a background, an explanation. That's why we live here. Maybe the reality is different. Do they really go skiing that often? But having the opportunity, the potential is valuable. It's an example of the good life, a classic example, contact with nature, and is part of the Norwegian culture. The opposite of the technical focus proposed in ZEN to solve emissions problems. And with this legation comes challenges. Elverum is flat and compact. The Idre neighbourhood is within walking, cycling distance to the town centre. In theory, it should be possible to do without a car. The master plan for the neighbourhoods has a strong focus on mobility. It is one of the KPIs that's been chosen for Idre. The master plan proposed a communal parking car parks, and not outside your house, no garages, no carports, and it intended to limit the use of private cars. And this has not been well received. And this is in a town where people like to be active. An informant told me that even the elderly feel they have to go for a walk every day. This is an informant from abroad, so I wasn't used to this idea of being so active as in Norway. The development of housing and the sale process in Idre has gone slower than expected. Locals blame the measures to limit the use of cars. They're critical to the plans for the neighbourhood. And the point of my examples from Idre Living Lab is to understand the connections and disconnections with ZEN and everyday life in Elverum. And what informants told me is that when you live the good life, experience happiness and well-being, you're not often experiencing anything extraordinary. You're experiencing the ordinary. Examples of the good life are often associated with being with the family, skiing with the kids, celebrating a wedding, meeting a wife, watching the children grow up safe in the town. They're examples of ordinary everyday life. The idea of everyday life is closely linked to the home, but it also interacts with work, school, leisure, and the connections between those. Marianne Gullestad tells us that in Norway, closeness or nærhet is part of the ideal relationship with family and the home, and this is characterized by care. In Elverum, the ability to care for the family largely depends on the car. It reduces the distance, keeps the family's life going. When we talked about Idre, the informants often talked about their families or the logistical challenges that families face. In addition, distance is not the same everywhere. It depends on who you are. And this was highlighted for me when I went for a walk with the Idre kindergarten. Now, I have children, but it's a long time since they were 4 or 5 years old, and I'd forgotten how terribly slow children walk. So I went for a walk which would have taken me maybe 20 minutes at a normal 50-year-old walking pace. And this took me 2 hours with the children, and I was absolutely exhausted and very, very hungry at the end of it. So people are different. They have a different relationship to distance. And distance is different in a small town. A big city has many other challenges and priorities, but a 10-minute walk is probably different. Public transport is more accessible. People in Elverum cannot imagine living without a car. Many of them have 2 cars. Public transport is limited because there is not the demographic foundation for a more active bus service. The train line to Oslo is a source of frustration. Focusing on mobility at the start of the neighbourhood development caused a lot of negative press for the project. ZEN's imaginary seems foreign, an urban concept. So to round off, and I've gone a bit over time, sorry about that. This is ongoing work without any final conclusions. The main question today, how are technology choices and solutions relieved by the people living their lives in the pilot neighbourhoods? You could conclude that there are a few simple connections between ZEN's objectives and the pilots. In Idre and Elverum, the focus on mobility challenges acceptance. The idea of limiting the use of cars is in the public eye. This is what many people remember about the project. At the same time, there seem to be connections with a sustainable future. People talked about sustainability in everything. They talked in many things that they talked about, not everything, absolutely everything, but in many things about talking about their everyday lives. There's faith in nature, a need to take care of it, a desire to take care of the city and its people. They want more public transport. They see Elverum as a small town where things are within walking and cycling distance. Elverum is on its way to being sustainable, but it may not be so obvious to everybody. So how can we use the local to influence the universal ZEN? A living lab offers examples, different kinds of stories, things that challenge the official ZEN, like proposing a rural ZEN or a forest ZEN, rather than focusing on the KPIs. Elverum has been ambitious. Not everything has gone smoothly, but Elverum Vexed, people working with Idile, are optimistic. It is possible to learn from what has happened in Elverum, and Idile is rethinking its mobility strategy. A final reflection is that navigating the local and universal should begin earlier. ZEN has worked closely with its stakeholders. They've supplied local knowledge, but not end user knowledge. Citizen engagement is required through all stages of pilot development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for some fascinating insights into the local contexts of the pilot projects of ZEN. I would now like to give the word to Per Gunnar for some comments before we open for a general discussion. And yes, digital applause or real applause for Ruth.
Thank you. So yeah, thanks a lot for being invited to this seminar and to gain insights from your work in ZEN and especially your work, Ruth Woods. I found it very fascinating and interesting to listen to. And it also is an opportunity to kind of to get in contact with each other. We met each other at the conference earlier, but I think there are certainly lots of opportunities to share experience, knowledge, and research between the Include Center, where we also have pilots, and we also would like to do experiments. So, the experience that you have from the ZEN Research Center is really important. I also find your case studies and the way you've been working with them quite fascinating, especially Elverum, which you really went into depth in studying. So I'm going to come back to that because I have a couple of questions, maybe especially related to the possibility of doing a kind of comparative approach looking at these three places. So even if some of the places, like especially one of the cases like the kindergarten and Steinkjer was kind of perceived as a failure, I think, you know, you can learn a lot from the failures and why it actually turned out. You had some explanations as well, but I would really like to discuss that a bit more. So, but I'll start to just ask a couple of questions about the kind of living lab or pilot experimentation way of working. So I'm coming from a tradition where there are you would pick cases and study people's everyday life based on research questions and so on, or you would do surveys or collect register data to understand how people live. But I see within kind of sustainability research in general, there's more and more of creating kind of real life experiments and labs in order to both develop something, a new type of practice, and also at the same time learn from it, which I think is really an exciting opportunity. One thing I wonder about some of these experiments and pilots, and that's also my experience with working with it myself, is that sometimes the kind of larger structures of society, which are so important, like, for example, looking at car use, it's about the road system, it's about the price of gasoline, it's about the kind of institutionalized system of automobilism in a way. And sometimes these things come in the background, but I feel that these are also important explanations because they play out differently in different contexts. So they play out differently in Steinkjer if you compare with the center of Oslo or center of Trondheim, or a place where the kind of also maybe the cultural or political context is different, like in Bakklandet. So I would like you, could you comment on that? How, what do you think is the kind of drawbacks when it comes to using living labs, or how you could pull in a bit more about the kind of structural perspective on things, if you understand my question.
Not sure, not completely sure, but I think the problem, the thing about ZEN is it is a universal concept and it's an urban concept. very much. That's something that has hit home to me very strongly in Elverum, that you can't apply the same mobility concept in Elverum that you can apply in Trondheim or in Oslo. I mean, Trondheim and Oslo are also different. So you have to think about how things can be relevant. You have to consider the relevance of the concept before you say, this is how you're going to do it, which is a little bit the way ZEN has approached it, that these are indicators, use them, and they will help you, but it hasn't always been helpful. That's my experience of it. And working with living labs, working with the experimentation thing, this isn't sort of an expectation that we should experiment, and we would like to experiment because it is interesting to experiment, because it creates it's this break from the obvious, from the everyday, doing something that brings things in, highlights the changes that are coming or the challenges that are involved with ZEN. But in Steinkjer, there was no experiment. We never got that far. The pilot disappeared before there was any opportunity to think about experimentation. In Evenstad, we did experiment. In Elverum, I thought I was working towards an experiment. What I ended up was sort of fiddling with a hypothesis that there perhaps isn't such a distance between ZEN's idea of the good life and the life that people living in Elverum. It just seems like the concept is very foreign to the people living in Elverum. So there's always this idea that there's universal concepts, the sort of the imaginary that has been established by ZEN in relationship with its partners, its stakeholders, isn't directly relatable to people in the pilots. And I think that's what you're saying, these big infrastructures, the things that are behind. Is that what you're guessing at, or have I misunderstood?
Yeah, well, I think there's lots of things. I just feel sometimes that these pilot studies or living labs, they focus, of course, on the change in practices. So people's actual practices that could be changed towards a more sustainable kind of everyday life practice. So that's a kind of imagination, or the sustainability imagination. So you should use your bicycle, you should use your public transport, and you should have a meter to kind of survey your own electricity use and so on. Which is nice, we need that kind of shift. So the question is then, when we have these experiments that give us experience, I think if we're going to upscale it, we need also a bit more knowledge about the kind of big structures of things. It may be kind of cultural structures of political choices and so on that may differ from place to place. So the context would certainly be important. So I think your study of Elverum, where you take the kind of larger context into consideration in studying why it's difficult to change people's practices when it comes to car use, is really important. So you look at the kind of the family structure, the kind of how they use nature, their ideals when it comes to recreational activities. And so I think those things are really important to understand the potentiality for change. Another question I had was related to the question of neighborhood, because within sociology and human geography, neighborhood is not necessarily something that you could just, it's not a building or a set of buildings or something that you could kind of delineate on a map, but it's relations between people. It's something that may have developed over time. So there's a feeling of community, and that community is maybe combined with a kind of sense of place. I think I sensed that was also the case for Elverum, that and especially when you have all these different threads and relations on top of each other. So your family and your friends, and you maybe also meet at a store, or especially in small places. But could you say something about the potential of community in this? Is there because in some cases we've been studying also these ecological village pilots all over Norway, and there is a selection of people. So people move into those kind of neighborhoods who are interested in living locally together with people that thinks the same way as themselves, have the same kind of ideology and want to live a sustainable life. So have you any experience with the role of community?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's obvious when you're working with neighborhoods. A neighbor is a person. A neighborhood is a collection of people. If you look at what defines a neighborhood, it's the people who live next door to each other, that kind of thing. But ZEN doesn't see it in those terms. ZEN sees it as a technical connection that people. I mean, there are people. They realize that people are living there. Will be able to exchange energy with other buildings, but it's buildings exchanging the energy, not necessarily the people. It's the technological context that is the neighborhood, and it's also what defines the boundaries of the neighborhoods, because there's a very clear idea of attempting to create boundaries to where a zero emission neighborhood is. So it's a neighborhood in the ZEN context is buildings that have a very highly ambitious, that are zero emission buildings that are relating to ordinary buildings and exchanging energy with buildings with the solar panels on them and the district heating system connecting the buildings. That kind of buildings are neighbors in the ZEN context. Whereas my take on it is that this is not going to work very well if you don't understand the social context around it, that there are challenges, and they're constantly experiencing challenges with the concept, because it's very hard to create technical boundaries. The people are there disturbing this, and when they're choosing the key performance indicators, which I've just been thinking about the 7 very clear technical things, they imagine that these are very relevant within this boundaries, that they can create boundaries using these. And then you see in Elvin very clearly that mobility as an indicator for achieving zero emissions, reducing private car use is not going to work, because the people at the moment are ready to accept it. And that doesn't mean that Elvin will never accept not using cars, but there are other things, the wider system, the wider technical system that you mentioned earlier, the fact that the public transport system doesn't work, which hinder that acceptance at the moment, at the current stage of time. So if the neighborhood context, when they were deciding, if they thought about, if they had this idea of the small town in the middle of the forest that is isolated from Oslo and Hamar because it doesn't have railway lines, then maybe they would have chosen another performance indicator, or focused on the energy side, which is one of the things, or the green, and used other things to get the neighborhood acceptance, if you want to call it that, and includes them more in the local context. But they chose to focus on mobility, or that was the one that really got the public focus, you could say. Yeah. So yeah.
No, I think I find that really interesting. I think you've got a theme for an article there.
I hope so.
Technical and the social neighborhood.
Yeah.
Did I ask another question, or Sarah, or should I? Okay. Yeah. So, well, I think that's really important, that if we're studying people's behaviors and would like to upscale changes in social practices, we have to theorize practices as well, of course. I think it's really important to take that seriously, that part of doing research for upscaling sustainability. I think that's really important. So if you choose Bourdieu's perspectives, for example, there's a huge vocabulary and a lot of concepts that could be used to actually investigate places like this, and these kind of you're of course familiar with that, I would expect, but I'm just saying it still because I find those ways of, if you use practice theory or Bourdieu's cultural capital, social capital, and economic capital or symbolic capital to kind of to study the capacities and also possibilities for changes in social practices, I think that's quite important. I just wondered, do you have you in the ZEN project or the center chosen centrally located places as well. But for example, when it comes to car use, it's kind of a general agreement that there's a huge potential in urban areas and suburban areas, while in rural areas there's not that large potential of very understandable reasons. As you mentioned yourself, the distances are much larger and people live different types of lives, and there's no public transport and so on. But have you done studies or pilots in centrally located places as well?
Yeah, I haven't. But ZEN is a very urban context. We have Furuset in Oslo as one of the pilots. I think you include. Entrance is also working on Furuset. We have Sluppen in Trondheim, the Gløshaugen campus in Trondheim. But surprisingly, because even though it is a very urban context, it's sort of inspired by the big city challenges, densification and mobility. Very many of the pilots are very rural, and this is something that is just I just happen to end up in the rural locations because of when I started. I was asked, can you just go step in and follow Steinscheid just to watch the planning process? We think there's things that can be learned. Evenstad, which is the technical playground, as I mentioned, is testing the things that are supposed to be transferred to very, very urban locations. It's in the middle of nowhere. There is nothing there. There's 200 people that use that on a daily basis. Zero Village Bergen, which is our pilot in Bergen, is outside the city, quite a distance from the city, and has problems getting its accept for the development of the neighbourhood because it's so far out of the city. It doesn't have a service centre, it doesn't have public transport. So many of these pilots are dealing with rural problems. And why is that? Because we're in Norway. It's, I mean, the 53% of the world's population living in urban context now, but not in Norway. Over 82% live in smaller locations outside the big cities. So it's obviously, and I think that it's like these FMEs, and generally, I suspect we don't have a rural FME. I suspect that most of us are dealing with urban challenges, and probably a number of us are dealing with them in rural locations.
Mm. So, yeah, I can kind of understand, you know, that it's easier to kind of isolate a project when it's geographically, when it's in a rural area. Maybe it's easier to get an overview and all that, and also maybe the technical issues are easier to kind of implement. Yeah. I could understand that, but I think it's really important to study these urban contexts, not only workplaces and institutions, but also larger neighborhoods. The latest number on urbanization that a colleague of mine has been mapping now is that, well, all the larger cities in Norway are increasing in population, the Oslo region the most, and especially the surrounding municipalities, the suburban landscape. So most people actually live in suburbs. That is a global phenomenon. So I think the huge challenge is in how to make suburbs more sustainable, actually. Because at least when it comes to mobility, it's quite easy to live a quite sustainable life, and the share of public transport use and walking and cycling is much higher in the central city. But that's only a small part of the city, and the part of the city that grows most is the suburbs. Even if there's a lot of talk about re-urbanization, that's mostly on a symbolic level, and it's mostly people between 19 and 30, and it's also more about recreation, actually. That number shows that. Well, I shouldn't take more of the time, but thank you. This was really interesting.
Thank you, Gunnar. Very nice talking to you again.